I've been riding this Pivot Firebird the last few weeks, and it came with this Fox DHX2 coil shock. And I was kind of wondering, how would this bike ride with the Fox Float X2 rear air shock? So today we're gonna go back and forth between the coil and the air and find out how exactly they differ on the trail. I was running a 500-pound spring, though when you guys saw Logan and I riding this bike, we had a 450-pound spring on there. I'm running about 215 PSI in the Fox Float X2 shock. And I've got both of the damping setups on these two shocks pretty darn close to each other. I'm running minimal low speed compression, about 2 clicks of high speed. I've got the high speed rebound backed out all the way with about 2 clicks in. And then the actual low speed rebound, it's about 4 or 5 clicks in from all the way open. So it's a pretty undamped, pretty open feel for both of the shocks. Before we do any more analyzing, let's just drop in and get a few clips with the air shock, and then we'll swap over to the coil. This first section of trail is a bit of a steeper, faster single track that I really enjoy riding. And right here, this is some of the first bit of trail I've ridden with that Float X2 rear air shock. So I really like this air shock. That's the very first bit of trail I've ridden with it. And man, I've ridden this trail with the coil before, so I can speak from previous experience that I really liked the way the air shock felt. Yeah, I know it's relatively new. It feels close to broken in already, but one of my favorite things about the air shock, I can feel where the rear wheel is. I also like how when I'm going over those undulations, I can push into the bike and it rockets me forward. Traction, there's plenty. I was not having issues with skidding or anything like that. So I really like the air shock. I like feeling where the rear wheel is. As I'm pushing into it, I got plenty of support. I really like this thing. Let's throw in the coil. I always carry a coil in my right pocket if you haven't noticed. Now I'm going to carry an air in the right pocket. So time for the coil shock. There's a bit of a weight difference here. All right, so our little air shock comes in at 627 grams, and our coil shock comes in at 860. I don't know how much I can really tell that weight difference when I'm mashing down the trail. In theory, we should have more traction with this coil shock, and we should have more rear wheel articulation. The rear wheel should move around a little bit more because it's a little bit smoother, a little bit more traction. Let's see if that's actually the case. A lot of the times when you're riding mountain bikes in the woods, you're surrounded by bike stands. They try to put the trails next to the best bike stands, so it's easy to swap shocks. Now let's ride that same steep, fast single track with the coil shock installed instead of the air shock. Today we're drinking Element in the orange salt flavor. Element's a very simple electrolyte solution, and I've been drinking this stuff for almost a year now. Here in the Northwest, it rarely gets super hot, but it's quite humid, it's surprisingly humid. We're also pretty far north up here, northwest, and we're pretty close to the sun in terms of latitude. So even though if you look at the temperature on like your trusty iPhone, which might not show it's that hot of a temperature, we're pretty close to the sun. So it kind of zaps your hydration pretty quickly. I like these Element packets because it's a really simple mixture of potassium, sodium, magnesium, and then just a little bit of stevia extract to help sweeten it and make it quite yummy. Honestly, these are really delicious. I found that with these hydration packs, I can make one bottle be far more effective than, say, an entire Camelback, but no electrolyte supplements. As you're out there sweating, all the electrical conduits for your body are getting sweated out. That's why you see these yellow and white residues on like your clothes, your hydration packs. That's the salt you've just sweated out. And when you're low on electrolytes, your brain's sending out electrical impulses to control the muscles in your body. Well, they don't conduct as well when they don't have those electrolytes that they need for electricity to flow through. That's why you can feel like a little lightheaded or woozy, or maybe your reaction time isn't as quick as normal when you've been sweating buckets on a hot summer day like today. For a limited time, Element's offering a free sample pack with the purchase of any order of Element product. To take advantage of that, head over to my URL on the Element website. That's drinkelement.com/Jeff. I'll spell it for you real quick. www.drinklment.com/Jeff, Jeff. Big thanks to Element for partnering up with me, and I hope you all get a chance to try this stuff because it's been treating me quite well this year. Before I discuss how the Coil shock actually felt different, let's take the Coil shock down to yet another section of trail. This time it's fast and flowy, but with a few more naturally occurring jumps. After we swap the Coil shock off, I'll then discuss how the Coil shock felt above and how it felt for this section here.
I want you to grab a little bit of brake and the tire started to skid.
Yes, I know I just said that Coil shocks have more traction, but if you grab a little bit too much brake, you can skid your tire regardless of the shock that's on your bicycle.
Oh, I tasted it! No! So, this first bit of trail is super fun. It's also very flat, and you've got to generate most of your forward speed. In this section of trail with the Coil shock, I was able to have a lot of fun, generated sufficient speed. I'm not gonna say I'm the world's fastest person through any of that, goodness no. There's a bunch of jumps, but you have to really work to get in the air for all the jumps, you know? They're not really intended jumps. With the Coil, it does absorb a lot of your input, kind of mutes your inputs to the bike a little bit. On the plus side, you have traction. On the downside, your pumps are kind of diminished a little bit. That said, the difference, I don't know how much it's gonna be, but with the Coil, I was still able to jump all the little poppers up top, was able to manual it, step down. There is a real sniper jump. They say the biggest jumps are always on the blue trails. They are correct. And the Coil shock was able to get across it no problem. That jump, you really have to get speed for by pedaling on some of the rough stuff. And the Coil is pretty good for that because the rear wheel does hook up, so you can mash. If you like to mash, the Coil is a great setup. Now, we're gonna try it with the air shock, so you can all rest assured that I'm not talking out of my Yahoo here. I'll put my mouth where my words are. Is that how you say it? Something like that. On one of those jumps, it's not really a jump, but it's a jump. I can't tell if I cased it or not on the second go around. Oh, I cased it! No. On the first go around with the Coil, I actually over cleared it. They just brushed this trail. They weed whackered all the shrubberies off the side, all the stinging nettle. So the line of sight's way better and it's easier to carry speed, which is really fun. But on the second go around, I missed a very important pedal stroke and didn't quite have enough speed, and I think I might have just slightly cased it.
So now we'll hit this fast, flowy section of trail with all those unintended but quite fun jumps with the air shock. If my hypotheses are correct, the air shock should be pretty good for this stuff because it responds well with a bit more progression than the Coil. Coil shocks are perfectly linear by nature, with the exception of a couple of small brands that claim to have made a progressive spring. Air shocks are naturally progressive, and you can put volume reducers in them to make them quite a bit more progressive. Usually that extra progression is great for jumps.
This is a real flowy, fast section of trail, borderline flow trail. And there's a few natural rises you can use to catch some air and kind of pop and flow your way down. In the past, I've shot this like a Ripmo with a DPX2. I really like that setup. It was very maneuverable in the air and really easy to get off the ground. First runs through, I had the Coil shock on, and rear wheel traction's really good. You know, it worked. I had a good time. It was solid. You can see from the footage, like I'm getting jumps, doing wheelies, having a good time. We threw on the air shock, the FoxFlow X2 air shock, and kind of immediately it was easier to get the bike off the ground. It was easier to jump, and I wish I had my data acquisition device on here. I have a hunch that the shock's not compressing as far when I push into it to preload, and that's why I'm able to get off into the air a little bit more easily. In terms of traction, the air shock maybe gives up like, what, 3% or something to the Coil, but nothing in that last section of trail really required a ton of traction. It didn't really have corners or like steep braking zones. Earlier, we did have some steeper trail and some corners. But my favorite part about this flowy section of trail here is that there's a bunch of like not really intentional jumps. They're kind of my favorite kind of jumps. They're a little bit awkward. And so with the Coil shock, I was able to make it over them there's like this water bar to hump gap. It's like a good, I don't know, 15 feet long, maybe 20. And you kind of got to yank for it. And with the coil, it's totally doable for sure. And getting speed into it, I found myself pumping a lot and pedaling a lot. And then getting over the mega yanker jump, it was doable with the coil. I kind of overcleared it once, but it was fine. Threw on the air shock, and then holy moly. So when I'm pumping through stuff, the bike responds a lot more. So I found myself pedaling less with the air shock and instead using my legs to pump the bike into all the little, is that a snake?
I feel like I keep hearing them, yeah. You see one?
No, but that was a big slither, wow. Welcome to summer in Bellingham, where we have ferocious gardener snakes all over the place.
Is it gardener? It's garter, I think, like a leg garter.
A leg garter snake?
I think, well, I don't know, I think that's the right term. Like, I think it's garter.
I thought it was like a landscaper, because you see them in the garden, they take care of it. They get all the pests out of there for you. They're gardener snakes. I used to call them Western racers. I once got bit by one of those black with yellow striped snakes right here, and I was trying to catch it because it was eating goldfish out of my friend's pond. Anyhow, that's the first and last time I tried to catch one of those snakes. Yeah, so pumping down this hill, I was able to get plenty of lift at the shock, and you can see I have my backpack on one of them, and I actually overcleared this significantly. And in the wintertime, this jump's hard to clear because it's so slow rolling. Summertime now, it's all hard pack and fast. Felt like I was landing down here where I'm standing on this route. You're supposed to land up there, or even higher up, there's another nublet. So yeah, the air shock, in my experiences thus far, it's easier to get in the air, and then it responds better to pumping, and those are both things that I find more fun. So yeah, so far I'm kind of leaning more towards preferring the air shock for sections of trails that I'm like most enjoying riding my bike on. So let's try some tighter, more technical stuff and see if the difference in traction plays more of a role. Let's get to it.
This section of trail is much more prototypical Pacific Northwest trail riding. It's got some roots, it's got some natural bumps, it's a bit rougher. In these shots here, I'm on the air shock, but I went into this having a suspicion that this is where the coil shock would most shine. At the end of this section is a fun little gap from roller to roller, and it is indeed a bit of a yank.
This probably doesn't look like much on camera. In the past, I've actually been nervous before to send this gap, because it's like you're taking off around like, you know, head tube height high, and then landing into a turn with trees on both sides. It's a little bit hectic. Lately I've been feeling pretty good on it. As it's gotten drier and this trail's turned into more of a flow trail, it's easier to keep speed up into it, and then you've got more space to land, so it's gotten a lot easier. But I was on the air shock, and popping through all this before it, I didn't pedal hardly at all, and I had enough speed to get over the distance. And I know it probably doesn't look like much on camera. It's a little bit tricky to do it in real life because you've got like a narrow landing window. You got to keep that speed up. There's always little snaggers so you can catch a pedal. So pumping is a really effective way to get your speed up for this gap. And also the way the lip's not huge and not all built up, you got to get some lift off that. And that's a spot where the air shock really helps because it's a bit more progressive and you can push into it. And with it being a little firmer, a little sooner, you can then get a tad more lift as opposed to the coil. Let's swap it back over to the coil and see if I can still make it. Probably will, because I did the other day with the coil. But let's see how much I got to pedal compared to just pumping with the air shock. And if there's any other things that pop up while we're here. Out with the air, in with the coil. I thought I might like the coil more on the pivot than on some other bikes because the pivot's not tuned to be the most small bump compliant. It's not tuned to be the plushest bike. It's tuned to have a bit of a platform for pedaling and to push into. Some folks don't like that, some folks do. This is such a riding style based thing and of which you prefer. It's also bike specific. I usually do like having a little firmer suspension. I like to feel the trail and have my inputs push me forward rather than be erased.
And now with the coil shock installed, let's get back on that tight, technical, bumpy section of trail. After a few runs on that same bit of trail that ends at that gapper, we went to yet another section of prototypical Northwest style trail. You saw this section a few moments ago. However, now we're riding it with the coil shock installed. So how do they feel different? Well, let's get to it.
Man, I'm actually pretty surprised. First run through this with the coil shock compared to the air, I did notice it's plusher. It felt more in control. And in this section of trail, that was a great feeling. I was having more fun, I was relaxed. It's still firm enough I was able to pump. So that's good. Yeah, I definitely like the air shock a ton when it's jumpy and it's more like a, I don't know, built up flow trail. This is still kind of a flow trail, but it's a lot rougher. Yeah, I'm really impressed. The coil shock was nice through this. So I'm gonna do it again, and then we'll go hit some actual jump trails too. But yeah, this is definitely working out pretty good through here.
And finally, I wanted to ride something that was more A-line-ish, something that was more of what people probably think of when you hear the term flow trail. So, with the coil shock still on the bike, we went and hit one of these types of trails.
Just to make this a realistic experience, I'm gonna make sure I drop my Allen wrench and my water bottle on the workshop floor. I'll be careful because I don't want to drop pivots. Ow, that's sharp. I don't want to drop pivots. Shock on the floor, I'd be disrespectful. Oh, look at that product placement. It's all shiny, there's X's.
Pivot looks very gray right now.
Yeah, the color, we had a lot of good answers when I asked everyone what color this bike is. And I think the color changes depending on how much shade and light, or how much you've had in terms of hydration that day. Yeah, it changes on Mondays compared to Tuesdays. It fluctuates. Maybe it's fluctue green.
So here I'm hitting that same jump trail with the air shock installed. Now to make this test even more realistic, I've taken the front wheel off the ground and ridden on only the rear shock. This will give us a much better analysis. Just kidding.
Well, I think we can clearly deduce that the air shock is the one to get if you want to do wheelies. I kind of like the air shock a touch more for wheelies. It's a little more progressive, so you're not moving around as much in the travel. It's a little bit bumpier, but you're not going very fast when you're doing wheelies, so that's fine. I don't know if you should buy a shock based on how many wheelies you do. Even someone who only does wheelies isn't necessarily sold on one type of shock for a wheelie per se. We rode a few more sections of trail that had some steeper bits, that had some rougher bits, that had some really awkward hucks. And then we even tried a flow trail where there was a really cool manual line, and then hit some jumps getting our way out of the woods. I've hit a lot of jumps with the coil. Air shock jumps pretty good. I've hit a handful of jumps now with the air. And you know what? If I was gonna buy a bike and I had my choice, I would probably go for the air shock. I like how it has more adjustability. I like how it's lighter. I also like how I feel like it rides better. For me, it rides better because I can tell where the wheel is. When I go to pump and push into the bike, more of my energy is driving the bike forward. If I'm pumping into the coil shock, because it's perfectly linear, it's more prone to get deeper into the travel than is the air shock, which does have a bit more progression. If you look at the graph, F equals KX, that's what spring rate is. Coil shocks are perfectly linear. There's a couple companies that claim to make progressive coils. They haven't hit the mainstream yet. I've actually never tried one. Maybe that'll solve all the world's problems with coil springs. I don't know. But I can say that the Foxflow X2 is a pretty good rear air shock. And when trails are jumpier and you're trying to get more oomph out of your pumps, it's handy to have a little bit more progression in that air shock. It's also over 300 grams lighter, and all you need is a shock pump to change your sag, which is a big component of how your bike's gonna ride on the trail. When you're swapping springs out on the Foxflow DHX2, you have to remove the forward shock hardware. Then you've got to deal with getting the little circlip thing off, and then you can swap it out. So you've got to remove the actual shock from the bike and then futz around with the vise and everything to get this all apart. The air shock's a lot easier to adjust on the fly. Did I mention it's lighter? It's also cheaper because you don't need to buy a bunch of springs to find the optimal spring rate for your weight that day. Thank you all for joining us for this fun little experiment. I liked the coil shock in comparison more than I expected. If I didn't have an air shock at all, now I know, I would be totally stoked. I like the air shock a lot too. I think I'm gonna try to leave the air shock on a bit more, but I have enjoyed this. Our conditions here are changing rapidly. We had a very wet late winter and spring. All of a sudden things have gotten dry and dusty in the last week, so I might go to a burlier rear tire. I have had a few issues with skidding this little aggressive rear tire, so even with the coil it was skidding. If a burlier tire and the air shock's not a good combo, I'll go back to the coil.
Lately, I've been saying that a big part of my riding style is sprinting without pedaling, and that means pumping and carving and jumping and manualing and just kind of manipulating the bike through the trail in a way to carry the most amount of speed without actually just putting down pedal strokes. For this style of riding, I think an air shock works really well. Now, if you need to actually get pedal strokes down on the trail in all kinds of random places where there might be obstacles, bumps, roots, whatever, then I do think the coil shock works really, really, really well. Being a bit more supple and just having that touch more traction means you can get away with mashing through that stuff. Also, if you're more of just a monster truck rider holding on for dear life, charging straight down the hill, not worrying about finesse, I also think the coil shock tends to lend itself slightly more to that riding style than more of the finesse type rider. I did a little searching online, and it looks like both the DHX2 coil and the Flow X2 air shock are currently available over at Jensen USA.
Oh, a little hard.
Jensen's a big supporter of all the content I do, and I've got a couple links over to these shocks at Jensen in the YouTube description below. Anything you purchase while visiting Jensen will then help support my channel, which is a big part of how we make these videos happen.
I want to give a big thanks to Pivot for trusting me with this Firebird and for sending out the loaner shock. Thanks to Element for making this all possible. Thanks to Logan for holding the camera. Thanks to all of you for watching, and also big shout out to Jensen USA, P&W Components, and Industry 9. Let me know in the comments down below, what shock do you prefer and why? And I'll see you guys in the discussion. Peace.